Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for today's card. I used the Altenew set called Persian Motifs to do this watercolor. I used a bunch of different stamps in the set, and then I have a few distress markers and my Ranger Detailer water brush. Now I'm going to take a piece of Ranger watercolor paper and I'm going to mark it at 2.5 on the top and the bottom, and then at 4 on the sides. And that's going to make sure that I cut off the same amount on each side. So I'm just going to connect those two lines and draw that with a pencil on both sides. And I'm using watercolor paper by Ranger because it's white, and I wanted to make sure that I had pure white paper because I'm going to be doing a white on white. So I'm going to take the stamps that I'm going to be using and place them right on my watercolor paper, and then I'm going to take some surgical tape to adhere them down to the foam that comes with the MISTI, because as you can see my stamps kind of overlay the paper, and I wanted to make sure I kept my paper in the same spot. So I'm actually going to color these stamps direct to the stamp with the marker itself. This is peeled paint, and I'm going to kind of lay it off to the side, kind of down sideways, so that I get the widest area of the brush. And I'm just going to color the part of the stamp that's the stem. Now you could probably try to do this with an ink pad, but it'd be hard to make sure you stopped exactly at the right spot, like before the flower. And so I'm going to keep it on the MISTI so that if, in case I need to stamp it again, I'll be able to, and I can just color some of the areas that I missed. But here I'm doing Picked Raspberry. This is the second color that I'm using, and all my flowers are going to be this color. So once I get the flower colored, I'll stamp it down, see if I missed any spots. And on this one I did, so I went and figured out, it was kind of hard to figure out because it's in reverse, which parts I missed, and I colored them again with the marker, and then I just closed the MISTI again. And it's fine to leave them up there because they're always stamping in the same exact location. So I'm going to continue this and stamp all of my stems in the peeled paint and the flowers in the Picked Raspberry. Now I'll peel off my surgical tape, and I'm going to take the leaf stamps, a couple of leaf stamps, and I'm going to use the peeled paint, which is the same color I used earlier, and I'm going to stamp those with an ink pad, just kind of randomly, just to fill in some of the blank areas. Now I'm going to erase my pencil lines because once you apply dye ink to pencil lines, they're really hard to get off. So get those pencil lines off first. And now I'm going to start my watercoloring. So I'm going to color the dark areas, like the shadow areas, directly to the cardstock with my marker. This is the same color I stamped with, Picked Raspberry. And my shadow areas are going to be in the center of the flower. And I'm going to go in there with my water brush. This is the detailer brush, so it's really small. I'll start in the white area and move my way toward the color and kind of pull it out a little bit, but not too much. And as long as you keep inside the lines of the Picked Raspberry stamp, it's not going to bleed your stamp outside the lines. So just make sure you cover the water with just the area that you're coloring. Notice that I skipped petals in between because I wanted to make sure that I didn't have petals kind of rolling into each other, because if you do put two petals, if you color them together, they might blend together. So I wanted to make sure that I kept each petal separate, and so I'm going to alternate with the location of each petal, and then I'll fill in the middle as those dry. Now I did add one extra color. I added some scattered straw to the center of the flower just to add a different color, just for variation. Now I'm going to do the same exact thing on the leaves. I'm just going to kind of highlight areas, and I really honestly don't have a rhyme or reason for how I'm highlighting these. I'm just kind of getting a two-tone. I think on most of the stems I'll color the left side of the stem, but other than that I'm just sort of highlighting each of the different pieces and then coloring it with my, or just watering it with my water brush here. I'm just going to go through and do all of these leaves the same exact way. And if you want a little bit more darker color, as you can see right here, what I did was I put a little bit of marker on my craft mat and I picked it up with my aqua painter, and that'll give you a little bit more of a darker color. Now that my petals have dried, I'm going to do the same exact technique on the ones in between. Color them in and pull the water out to the edge. And by waiting till those other ones dried, notice that they're just staying within the petal that I'm working on. So I'm going to have to let these dry, and then I'll go and do finally the outside petals in the very back. For the center of these leaves I used Shabby Shutters, which is just a different shade of green. So now these tiny little ones, I'm just going to make a little mark and color them out. And then I also colored the base. There are a couple of petals down at the base. Now around the center I wanted it to be light, so I covered it with water first. Then I picked a little bit of the picked raspberry off my craft mat to make sure that it was a very, very subtle light color. And then what I did was I went back in with my fine tip on the marker and I colored right around the edge of the center. And this really helped define it and really make that middle piece pop. I'm going to do a lot more of this later, but for this one I just wanted to do it quickly so you could see. Now the next two flowers on this card are similar and different than the first one. So I'm going to show you a few of the petals here. I'm using basically the same technique where I'm going to color directly to the cardstock with my marker in the shadow areas. And there's a line that comes up between each of the petals, like on the inside of the petal, and that's kind of where it's creased. And you're going to get a shadow there. So I'm going to make sure that on one side of that line that goes up, I'm coloring with my marker. Another thing you also want to keep in mind is every time there's a petal on top of a petal, it's going to cast a shadow on the petal behind it, which is why you see me adding some color to the top of the petal that's in front of it. Now if you look closely, you'll notice that my paper is actually starting to pill up a little bit. That is one of the things that I really don't like about the Ranger watercolor paper, is that it really doesn't take much water for it to start shredding the paper. So you can't really brush it very much before it starts to pill up. And that's why most of the time I use my Strathmore watercolor paper, because you really have to apply a lot of water to that paper before it'll start acting like that. But the one thing I do love about the Ranger watercolor paper is that it's a very bright white color. So anyway, that's the reason why I used it on this card, because I'm going to be doing a white on white. The background's also going to be white, so I didn't want it to be off white on top of white. Anyway, you could see right here that it's really noticeable that the paper's peeling up. It's not that it looks really super bad, it's just, it's not my preference. So anyway, so I'm just going to go through here and I'm going to fast forward this and you can see the rest of the coloring. Alright, now that I'm finished with all my coloring, I'm going to do what I did earlier on this flower, which is I'm going to take the fine tip of my picked raspberry and I'm going to outline some of the petals. And I'm not going to outline everything because then it's just like stamping it again. So I'm just going to highlight some of the different petals, especially at the base where there's going to be a shadow. And I also decided to add a little bit more pop to those petals that are in the very back of this flower. So I just colored the base of them with the fine tip. And when you use the fine tip of these distress markers, you get a lot of color. So you can see this flower really starts to come alive as I draw the outlines. And I'm actually kind of drawing outside the outline. So I'm not actually going over the stamp. I'm kind of creating a shadow behind it. And you kind of have to know when to stop. Like I think I went a little bit too far with this. I wish I would have stopped maybe like 3 or 4 lines early. But it's kind of nice to have that extra little dimension by drawing the lines on top of the different creases and on the edges. Now, by the way, if this makes you a little nervous, you don't have to do this step. This is totally optional. You can skip it, and I think the flowers look beautiful just as they are. And then I also did the same thing on the leaves as well. So I'm going to fast forward this so you can kind of watch these flowers and leaves come to life. Now, one final step I did with these flowers was to add a little bit of black to the center, just in the middle, kind of flicking upward, just to add a little something to make it a little more realistic and a little, just to make it pop. All right, so now I'm going to trim this out based on the lines that I drew earlier. I kind of left the edges of them, and I'm really sorry about my watch being in this thing. It's so distracting, and I totally forgot that I had it on. It's the new iWatch, or the Apple Watch, and I just got it, so I was really excited about using it. Anyway, so now what I did was I cut a few strips, 1/8 of an inch of slate cardstock by Simon Says Stamp, and I'm just going to press this up against the edge of my cardstock just to kind of outline it a little bit. And I decided not to use black because I didn't want it to be too stark of a contrast. I wanted to keep it a little softer. So I used slate, and I used a 2-way glue pen. This is the Altenews Sentiments and Quotes set, and I used this Sending Love Your Way, and I inked it up with some VersaFine black onyx ink. And then I'm going to stamp it diagonally just for something different. And that will complete the card for today. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.